Throughout its history, the United States has always projected itself as the guardian of international order. But of course, the keen observers of history would disagree greatly. And I don't mean Trump and his current belligerent policy, whether in Latin America or the Middle East or even toward Europe. In today's video, we are examining one of America's innumerable violations of international law. It happened much earlier under the leadership of a president largely considered resolute and measured, George H.W. Bush. Today, we are going to talk about the U.S. invasion of Panama on December 20th, 1989, launched to abduct the Panamanian head of state, Manuel Noriega. But before we talk about the invasion of Panama, we have to understand the relationship that tied that small country to the United States. For nearly a century, Panama wasn't treated as a fully sovereign country by Washington. It was viewed as the host of the Panama Canal, a vital geopolitical artery that the U.S. built, owned, and militarily occupied. The canal was so important to the U.S. that it forced the secession of Panama from Colombia in 1903, creating a much smaller new country that it could coerce into building the canal the way it wanted. The French had originally started trying to build the canal while the area was still a part of Colombia. That was a mission led by the famous French engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps, the man who successfully completed the Suez Canal in 1869. However, owing to disease, horrible mismanagement, and outright corruption, the French finally abandoned the project after spending almost 20 years on it from 1881 to 1899. The US took over, split Panama away from Colombia, and then started digging the canal with a new perspective and efficiency. Sure enough, the canal was finally completed in 1914, and the canal zone was de facto US territory until Jimmy Carter signed a treaty in 1977 that approved returning the territory and the canal to Panama. For decades, American dominance in the region relied on a specific kind of strongman. These were men who were willing to suppress communism and protect American business interests, regardless of their moral character. Enter Manuel Antonio Noriega. Before he was public enemy number one, Noriega was a favored instrument of the CIA. Throughout the 70s and 80s, he was on the American payroll, receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars. He provided intelligence on leftist movements in Latin America and acted as a back channel to Cuba. He was also immensely valuable in US covert support of the Contra insurrections against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Equally important, Washington knew exactly who he was. They knew about his brutality, and they certainly knew about his deep ties to the Colombian drug cartel. But in the binary logic of the Cold War, he was Washington's obedient gangster, and it was okay with that. However, by the late 1980s, the geopolitical winds were shifting, the Soviet threat was fading, and a new crusade was rising in American domestic politics, the war on drugs. Suddenly, Noriega's value as an anti-communist asset was outweighed by the embarrassment of his criminal enterprise. He was playing a double game, taking CIA money with one hand and waving through flights of cocaine with the other. When American courts indicted him in 1988, the relationship collapsed. But Noriega didn't fold. Instead, he dug in. US intelligence tried to remove him without bloodshed by clandestinely supporting his opposition. However, Noriega annulled a national election when the results went against him and sent his dignity battalions to beat opposition candidates bloody in the streets. He taunted President George H.W. Bush, betting that the US wouldn't risk a full-scale invasion. He was wrong. Tensions in the Canal Zone exploded in December 1989 after Panamanian forces at a checkpoint killed an off-duty US Marine. For the White House, this was the trigger, the pretext it was waiting for. But the response was not a surgical strike like what happened with Maduro in Venezuela in the opening days of 2026. It was a sledgehammer. On December 20, 1989, the US launched Operation Just Cause. Notice the cynicism of the name. Over 26,000 American troops descended on the small nation, the largest combat deployment since Vietnam. The objective was ostensibly to protect American lives and restore democracy, but from the very start, it was overwhelmingly devastating. The US Air Force and artillery bombarded the El Corillo neighborhood, a densely populated area loyal to Noriega. Blocks of wooden tenements and French company-era housing went up in flames. While the US military secured its objectives quickly and the Panamanian military effectively surrendered, the civilian cost was high, with hundreds, some estimates say thousands, of Panamanians dead in the crossfire. Amidst the chaos, Noriega the dictator vanished. A massive manhunt ensued, shutting down the country. In a twist that felt like it was written for Hollywood, Noriega resurfaced days later at the Vatican embassy. He requested political asylum, creating a bizarre diplomatic standoff. US troops couldn't storm the sovereign territory of the Holy See, so they decided to drive him out psychologically. The army surrounded the compound with massive speaker walls. For days, they blasted deafening rock music, The Clash, Van Halen, Guns N' Roses, 24 hours a day. It was psychological siege warfare designed to break the dictator's will. On January 3, 1990, broken Manuel Noriega walked out of the embassy gates. He surrendered to US Special Forces, becoming the first foreign head of state to be invaded and captured for trial in an American court. The images of Noriega in handcuffs were broadcast globally as a triumph of American justice. But for the international community, the invasion set a jarring precedent. The United Nations General Assembly condemned the invasion as a flagrant violation of international law. It signaled the dawn of a new era where the world's sole superpower felt empowered to intervene anywhere, anytime, to enforce its domestic laws abroad. The operation successfully removed a dictator, yes, but it reminded the world that when a superpower decides to clean up its own messes or impose its will, it proceeds with no qualms about the cost that the invaded countries and the locals have to pay and endure. The cynical part is that George H.W. Bush, the same man who embarked on this invasion that was condemned by the UN, would less than 2 years later rise as a world hero, leading a coalition to free Kuwait from an Iraqi invasion perpetrated by Saddam Hussein, another former US strongman. But let's leave that story for another episode.